I don't know if you need another video of me talking about how much I love VE Schwab, but that's what you're in for today. Hi everyone, my name is Chloe, welcome back to my channel. Thank you for being here today. I am here with the second instalment in my series of talking about my favourite authors, why I love them so much, what my sort of reading journey with them has been. And yeah, the first one in the series I did quite a few months ago now. I planned on doing these in a little bit quicker succession, but then other things got in the way, other content that I kind of was more time sensitive. But I suddenly had a gap where I was able to film one of these and get it put up. So in the first video I spoke about my love of Alice Oseman, and obviously she writes all contemporary fiction. So, and I wanted to make that video because I'd spoke a lot about fantasy in sort of the videos before that. And this is quite fitting that I am speaking about an author who writes all things sort of fantasy, speculative, various different genres within that, and fairly fitting because I've recently done a month of reading entirely contemporary fiction. So it's nice that we're still sort of mixing it up a little bit. And today I'm going to be talking about VE Schwab. Now, we all know that I love VE Schwab. I've spoke about her many times. I think some of my earlier videos in this channel was me reading one of the books that I'm going to be talking to you about today. But yes, I will always take another opportunity to talk about how much I love her and her writing, and sort of what it is that draws me to her writing style in particular. So the way these videos work is I basically talk through my entire collection of books that I own from a particular author, and I kind of go from least favourite to favourite. That being said, these authors are my all-time favourite authors. These videos are designed for you to get to know me and my reading style a little bit, and like I said, because these are my all-time favourite authors, none of these books are disappointing. Just because they are further down on my list doesn't mean that I don't like them. It's just that I love the top rated ones so much. So without further ado, let's start talking about VE Schwab. So I have quite a selection of books here today. I haven't read all of them, so I'm going to first talk about ones that I haven't read. There are also a few that I haven't read that I also don't own, but they are generally the sort of earlier books. I believe it's the Everyday Angel series, which is a middle grade series that she did sort of pre what we know her for now, and I haven't read those. I don't really have any intention in reading those, but ask me again in a few years, I might have changed my mind. There are a couple of books here that I haven't read, and I also haven't read anything from, if it's a series, I haven't read anything from the series either, so not even started. And the first one of those would be actually VE Schwab's debut book, which is The Near Witch. So this one was released quite a few years ago and went out of print, but since then VE Schwab's career has sort of taken off, so it got republished a few years ago. I do now own a copy, but I just haven't got around to picking it up yet. I don't really know much about what this one is either. I just know that eventually I would like to read it. I have heard that this maybe isn't quite as good as her more recent work, and that you can definitely see how her writing style has progressed, but that is fairly obvious when it is an author's debut, especially when they've had so many novels out since. I wouldn't expect to compare this to her most recent work, but I am hoping that I can enjoy it for what it is and still sort of see her writing style through it, and some things I sort of particularly relate to her and the rest of her books. The other ones that I haven't touched or started at all is a series. It is one of her older series as well, and that is the Archived series. So this is actually a bind up of the two novels, so it is the Archived and the Unbound, I believe. All I know about this one is it is a fantasy that involves books. I believe it's set in a library. Yeah, it says, everybody has a story to tell, a life seen in pictures only librarians can read. The dead occult histories and the vast realm in which they rest is the archive. And then there's sort of more to it. So yeah, it's a fantasy about books, about libraries. I do want to read it. The thing that's putting me off is that this was supposed to be a longer series. I believe it was supposed to at least be a trilogy. And as I've already said, there are 2 books in here. That is all we have. This series was kind of cancelled before it was allowed to finish, because again, it sort of came out before VE Schwab became as known as she is now, so it wasn't getting the sort of traction that the publishers wanted it to, and they declined on publishing a 3rd book. So I have heard very good things about this one. I know I sort of heard this one a lot in like booktube days of old, and I've been wanting to read it for a while, but the fact that it's unfinished really puts me off. But I will probably eventually get around to it. I know that VE Schwab has said that she would like to write a 3rd book in the series, but it's just sort of whether or not she'd be allowed to with like the sort of publishing rights and things like that. But fingers crossed it will happen someday, and yeah, I will get around to these ones eventually. So that's everything that I haven't read at all. There are a couple of other things that I want to sort of touch on separately before I get to anything else. So the first one is her new comic series, which has only recently started like 2 months ago, so there are only 2 issues out so far. far, and that is the Extraordinary series. So we have issue 0, which is like a starter introduction, and then the first sort of proper issue, which is issue 1. So these came out recently. These are set in the Villains universe, and I don't think I can sort of properly give my thoughts on these yet because I haven't read enough of them. I've only actually read issue 0 so far. Issue 1 I only got about 2 days ago and I just haven't had a chance to pick it up. But what I have read so far I am really enjoying, so hopefully I will have more thoughts on these later on and hopefully it will continue to be positive. And then next, before we get on to sort of the bulk of the stuff that I have here, I have 2 short story collections that have come out in the last year. One that I've read and one that I haven't. So the one that I have read was A Universe of Wishes, which features a short story which is actually a prequel to the Dark Shade of Magic series. It features 2 of the characters from there and how their sort of relationship got to the point that it did at the start of the second book in A Dark Shade of Magic. So I'm not going to say too much because it will give spoilers, but I absolutely adored this story. I was very happy that it existed because the 2 characters in here are 2 of my favourite characters from the Dark Shade of Magic series. So it was just lovely to have a little bit more of them and to sort of see how their relationship developed, because it wasn't necessarily in the best place by the time we got to A Dark Shade of Magic. So it was nice to see sort of the happier side before we got to that point. And then we have Vampires Never Get Old, which I haven't read yet. Again, I only received this the other day. This one features the story First Kill, which is a vampire story. It is a sapphic vampire story about a vampire who falls in love with a vampire slayer, and I'm very much looking forward to reading this. It is also being adapted into a TV series that is currently just finishing filming, I believe. So I can't wait to, pun intended, sink my teeth into this and also to watch the TV show. So on to the actual books now, and like I said, this is going to be sort of least favourites to favourites, but there is absolutely nothing wrong with my least favourites on here. In fact, the only reason that this series can actually be classed as my least favourites is just because of the age range that it's aimed at and the fact that I don't tend to enjoy a lot of books written in this age range, because that's middle grade. So that is the Cassidy Blake series, which is City of Ghosts, Tunnel of Bones and Bridge of Souls. So these all follow a girl called Cassidy Blake who can see ghosts. She had a near-death experience, and since then she has been able to see ghosts and also to sort of help them move on to the next stage in their life, moving on to the afterlife essentially. Now the thing is that her parents host a TV show where they are ghost hunters, although they can't actually see ghosts themselves, so it's all a little bit staged. So in this series she is travelling around the world, going to these most haunted places in the world with her parents so that they can film their TV series. But then obviously along the way she's going to these most haunted places in the world, she is meeting up with lots of ghosts, and she's helped along the way with a couple of friends. So there is another young girl who is also a ghost hunter, and then there is also her best friend Jacob, who is actually a ghost. And it's a really adorable story. For a middle grade, I did actually really enjoy it because I could still sort of see VE Schwab's writing style coming through. It still had like a little bit of a darkness and a little bit of an adult edge to it, which I really enjoyed. I don't think things need to be sort of dumbed down for a younger audience. So I really enjoyed that it was still quite complex whilst just being a little bit more simplified and a little bit tamer than possibly some of her other works are. And yeah, I really enjoyed everything about these. I just don't tend to read a lot of middle grade. It would be something very, very special for a middle grade to be sort of high up on a favourites list for me. Next up is the other sort of outlier in her type of work, and that is her graphic novel series, which is The Steel Prince, Knight of the Knives and The Rebel Army, and these are all prequels to A Dark Shade of Magic as well. So this is actually about the king, who is sort of the main character. Kel is his like adoptive father almost. It's about him when he was younger and when he was sort of coming into power himself. And again, I can't sort of tell you too much because it will end up spoiling storylines for Dark Shade of Magic, but I really enjoyed this. It's just that with it being a graphic novel series, again, I enjoy graphic novels, but I never quite enjoy them as much as prose. I just find that I can't get as much out of them. I find that fantasy, whilst great to be able to visually see them, I do find that I find it harder to understand the world when it's purely done through a graphic novel format. So I enjoyed these because I had read the books, but I don't think I would necessarily have enjoyed them as much if I just read them on their own. So the next book I have to talk about is where I'm going to start talking a little bit more about how I started reading VE Schwab. So all the ones I've shown you so far are sort of more recent reads. So the Cassidy Blake series, I've read each book as it came out. I sort of pre-ordered all of them. I was already a fan of VE Schwab's work by the time, so I've been getting those as and when they've been released. And then with the Shades of Magic graphic novels, I read those last year when I'd sort of finally finished the Dark Shade of Magic series, so I read them not long after, and I'll talk about that more in a couple of minutes time. The next book though is actually the second VE Schwab book that I read. The first one is going to be the one that I talk about next, spoiler alert, but this was the second one. I basically read a book from VE Schwab earlier on in the year, really fell in love with the writing style, read it fairly quickly and decided, why have I been holding off on reading from this author? I was still a little bit intimidated by the Dark Shade of Magic series because it was sort of more high fantasy, and at the time I hadn't read a lot of fantasy books and I was kind of struggling to figure out what I liked as a fantasy reader. So I decided to go with the Monsters of Verity series. So this was about 3 years ago now. It was in 2018, which was a time when these books were talked about a lot on BookTube, I would say. A lot of the sort of American booktubers that I was watching were talking about VE Schwab, and in particular this series. And with it being, this one is a urban fantasy, so that made it more appealing to me because I thought, well, at least I've got a little bit of an in to read it. So I picked up this Savage Song, which is obviously the first in the series, and I am not going to be able to give you a great synopsis of this because it's been a while since I read it, so I'm just going to read you what it says on the back, which is: Kate Harker and Orcus Flynn are the heirs to a divided city, a grisly metropolis where the violence has begun to create real and deadly monsters. All Kate wants is to be as ruthless as her father, who lets the monsters roam free and makes the inhabitants pay for his protection. August just wants to be human, as good-hearted as his own father, but his curse is to be what the humans fear. The thin truce that keeps the Harker and Flynn families at peace is crumbling, and an assassination attempt forces Kate and August into a tenuous alliance. But how long will they survive in a city where no one is safe and the monsters are real? Like I said, I don't have the best memory of this book. I do just remember really enjoying it, but for some reason never picking up the sequel, which is a thing that I do tend to do a lot, especially when it's a duology. I think I just have like fear of it ending, and like fear of not liking the ending sometimes, or fear of just sort of not having that story in my life anymore. I also do know that apparently this second one breaks you, so maybe that's why I've been putting it off. But this is actually on my sort of reading goals for this year: reread this Savage Song and then finish our Dark Duet. So hopefully I will have an update on that one later as well. I know I said I want to read sort of the first two, the ones that I haven't read at all yet, but this is sort of more of a priority because I'm literally halfway through this series. Speaking of being halfway through a series, the next one is actually one that I have rectified that issue for this year. So this is the first VE Schwab book that I ever read. So the story for this one is, again, I've been hearing about VE Schwab plenty on BookTube, and I decided I wanted to give her work a try. And like I said, I was more led to the urban fantasy style books because I thought that was an easier in. I am a big fan of superheroes, so the book Vicious was very appealing to me because this basically tells the story of Victor and Eli, and they are two friends from college who have a fascination with extraordinaries, or EOs, who are essentially superheroes or supervillains depending on what route they go down, because they are people with sort of enhanced abilities. And they find out the way to sort of create these abilities is through near-death experiences, so they do some pretty weird experiments. Doesn't quite go to plan, and it ends up with one of them in prison. And at the beginning of the story, they have just got out of prison and they go to sort of track down the other one. It's told in sort of like a non-linear pattern, so the timelines jump around and you go a lot from sort of present day to past, and I found that really interesting. Kept me really engaged. The chapters are really short as well, so you're never sort of in that thing where you pick up and you're like, oh well, I don't want to start the next chapter because it's like 40 pages and I don't know if I've got it in me to read that much. You look at it and you're like, oh, it's 3 pages, I can read that one, and then before you know it, you've read 10 chapters. It's great. It's a really easy, quick read. And basically I got this, not this copy actually, I don't own my original copy anymore because I hated the cover so much, but I asked for it for Christmas one year because, like I said, I wanted to read VE Schwab's work and this one really appealed to me, so I asked for it for Christmas, started reading it on New Year's Eve and finished it a couple of days later. And very quickly, this special edition was actually due out I think that year because the sequel Vengeful was coming out and they did like a matching set, so I bought the pretty special edition and got rid of my copy that I really really hated the cover of. It looked like an action film. It was just awful. And then basically what happened is I bought Vengeful the second it came out and then didn't read it for about 3 years. And I finally rectified that this year. I picked this one up earlier on in the year. There was actually a full sort of reading vlog about that. And I really, really enjoyed this one as well. It went further into the characters. It added some new characters. I will say I probably preferred Vicious a little bit just because there was something sort of magical about that first book that really sort of drew me in. And this one possibly suffers a little bit from middle book syndrome. So basically Vicious can be read as a standalone if you want to, but VE Schwab did always plan on it being a trilogy. She just wasn't sure if someone would publish all 3 books, and obviously she's sort of been burned by that before. So this time she left it a little bit more as a story that could finish, and then when she was able to, she went back and wrote Vengeful, and she is now planning on writing what I believe is going to be called Victorious. We just don't know when that's coming out yet because she has quite a few other books in the pipeline before she gets to that one. So I think when I get to Victorious, when that's out and I can sort of enjoy this as the middle part of the story, I will appreciate it a lot more for what it is as a whole. I think right now, being the last one that I read, I'm just a little bit like, okay, what's going to happen next? But I think as an overall, I think it will be a very, very good middle book. It's just hard to see it at the minute without the context of the bigger picture. So I have 2 more books to talk about, kind of. Well, I have 4 books, but I have 1 series and 1 standalone, and these are very much sort of neck and neck for my favourite VE Schwab books. They are probably her most popular books overall. The Dark Shade of Magic series is definitely the one that sort of grew her audience, I think. She'd been releasing other books, but this was the one I feel like where the growth really started to happen. And then The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue is her newest release, and that one has been a bestseller for weeks and weeks now, and that is the one that really pushed her into being more sort of widely successful, I think, and that is lovely to see as well, because I follow her like as a person as well on her social media and things like that, and it's really nice to sort of have seen her growth over last year, one with that being a bestseller, but then also with like film and TV adaptations of things, and there's new releases coming out now as well that just sound really exciting. I will talk about those in a minute as well, but yes, basically the question is, which order would I put these in? Like I said, I love them both, but I think it has to go this way. So again, talking about my story of how I started reading VE Schwab, I read Vicious first, then I read This Savage Song, then I started reading the Cassidy Blake series, kind of interspersed with other things, and then early last year I finally got around to reading the Darker Shade of Magic series. So, as seems to be the story of my life these days, I was interested in getting the special edition set from Illumicrate. You may see sort of hidden up there is actually the first one. The second and third will hopefully be on their way to me soon. There's been a shipping delay with them. But basically I had owned this one for a while, just hadn't read it. Wanted to order the special edition box set, but at that point I was very adamant that I needed to read it before I ordered it. And if you've watched some of my previous videos, you might know that that philosophy is how I ended up spending an extortionate amount for the first Dora Spoken Bone book. But for this time, I actually did manage to read this before I ordered it. So I read Dark Shade of Magic early last year, and I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars at the time. I think on reread it might be higher. But I sort of enjoyed it and was like, oh yeah, I'm going to order this now. I'm glad I got it. And then I thought, well, you know what? I'm not going to do what I've done with her other series. I'm going to push through and make sure that I read the second and third one. So I quickly ordered Gathering of Shadows and A Conjuring of Light. And this is where I fell in love with this series. The second one in particular just really drew me in. It had new characters that ended up being sort of my favourites in the entire series. It had a relationship that I loved in here as well. And it was all set around like a magical game trial type thing, which everyone always loves to read a little bit about as well. Actually, I've realised I haven't explained the storyline of this one at all. So this follows a character called Kel. Kel lives in a place called Red London. In this world there are actually 4 different Londons. So there is Grey London, which is very similar to our own London. There is Red London where magic is sort of flourishing. There is White London where magic is fought over and there is a lot of sort of power struggles there as well. And then there is Black London that basically got too close to the magic and ended up having to be sealed off from the rest of the worlds. And basically each of these different Londons is in its own sort of separate world, and only certain people can travel between these worlds. The main character Kel is one of these people. He's called an Antare, and it's basically the story of when something from one London ends up in another one where it isn't supposed to be. There's a lot more to it than that, obviously, but I think that's kind of all you need to know going into it. I'd say that each of these books is very different. So the first one is just setting up the worlds and sort of, like I said, what happens when they kind of collide a little bit. The second one is then, like I said, these magical games and things like that. And then the third one is it's a final one in a series. It's like a full-on war type book. And I love each of these for what they are. I love that they're so different, but also very cohesive. And I think apart from the sort of the world building, because that is really strong in these, I just really enjoy the characters. That's one of the things I really like from VE Schwab is her characters. Like in Vicious and Vengeful, you've got these really morally grey characters. You don't know who you're rooting for at any moment in time. In this one, you've got people that I just love and I just want to root for throughout it. And there's some of my favourite sort of like snarky characters in here as well. And then we'll talk about my favourite book that VE Schwab has written, and I know that this one's more polarising. I know that people either love it or hate it, but I am firmly in the love it camp, and that is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. So one of the reasons why I actually sort of read Dark Shade of Magic earlier on in the year as well is that I was very, very excited for this one to come out, and I wanted to read more of VE Schwab's work before this one came out, because I do have this thing about trying to read things in publication order, but I knew that I wasn't going to be able to do that entirely. But I wanted to at least read her biggest series before her new release came out. So this one I actually got in the Illumicrate box. You can see this is the sort of black and white special edition with the sort of grey sparkly sprayed edges on there as well. And part of the reason why I resubscribed to Illumicrate was actually because I wanted the October box with this book in there, and I managed to get off the waitlist in time for it, which I'm very excited about. But this tells the story of a character called Addie, who was born in France about 300 years ago, and it was a time when women didn't really have many rights. They were sort of, their lives were to get married, have kids, and that was it, just to be a housewife. And Addie knew that she was never sort of meant for that type of life. So she ends up making a deal with a devil called Luke and all she asks for is extra time. She wants more time to sort of live her life and figure out who she is. And he says, yes, that's fine, you can live forever. But the deal is everybody that you will meet will forget you. So basically every time somebody turns their back on her, every time a door is closed, they instantly forget that she was there. They instantly lose any memory of who she is. And that is everybody, including like her own family, everybody. So this story starts off there 300 years ago in France, and then flash forward to present day New York City. Addie enters the bookstore and meets a character called Henry, who for whatever reason remembers her. And it's about the two of them and the relationship they form, but it's also about so much more than that. There's a lot of talk of mental health in here. There's a lot about sort of what it just means to be alive. Like Addie's living in this world, but if no one's remembering her, is she even really there? There's a lot of talk of art and influence and things like that throughout it as well. And I just really, really adored this book. The character of Henry, when I said I was going to talk about characters, the character of Henry in particular is someone that I both relate to and also just want to wrap in a blanket and protect at all costs. And yeah, I just love it so much. I think the issue that some people have with this book is that they go into it expecting it to be something different than what it is. They expect it to be this more deal with the devil and sort of high stakes and things like that, and it's actually quite a simple novel. It's definitely more literary fiction than sort of fantasy, but that was something that I really, really liked. I really love beautiful writing, so the sort of lyrical feeling of this writing really got to me as well. And yeah, can you tell that I love this book? This was actually my favourite book that I read last year, and I'd say that although I read a lot of other books by VE Schwab before, this is the one where I was like, yes, I have found like sort of my book by her now. It's like, it's her latest release, but this was the one where I was like, yes, this is the book that she was writing for me. This was the one of all of her works that I was meant to read. So that is everything that I have that VE Schwab has released so far. She does have, like I did say, I'm going to talk about a few more books that she has coming out that I'm very excited for. So she just announced Gallant, which is described as Secret Garden meets Crimson Peak. Again, I don't know too much about the synopsis of it because I'm trying to stay away from it, but I believe that one comes out early next year. And that's one that I've been sort of following her writing process for on her Instagram, and I'm quite excited to read that one. The cover looks gorgeous, although it is the US cover, so I'm waiting to see what the UK one looks like. There is also going to be a sequel series series to the Dark Shade of Magic books. So this is going to be called Threads of Power. It's going to be a new trilogy, and VE Schwab has basically said that anybody who survived the Dark Shade of Magic series will be a significant character in the new series, which means that some of my favourites will be in there. So I'm very excited to sort of explore that world again and to see what those guys have been up to. The Dark Shade of Magic series definitely did end in a nice way that you can leave it there, but I still think there's plenty more to get from this world. I think it's one of those worlds that she could keep revisiting at different points if she really wanted to. And then somewhere down the line there will also be the new Victorious book, which follows on from Vicious and Vengeful, and that should be wrapping up that story as well. And I don't know what else, but I know she has plenty of plans. She's very, like I said, vocal on her social media, talking about sort of things that she has in the works. She seems to be planning ahead for many years to come, and that makes me very, very excited because that means that I have loads of new books by her. So thank you all for watching. Thank you for letting me gush about one of my favourite authors. Please like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff down below. Please tell me if you like VE Schwab. What's your favourite book of hers? Do our opinions match up? I know there's going to be quite a few people on here that probably don't share my thoughts of Addie LaRue, but I would love to know what your favourites actually are. Or if you've not read from her before, is there a book of hers that sounds sort of the most intriguing to you? And I will see you guys soon with a new video. Bye!